switch us on over. And people heard me say, switch us on over. Hello.
And that's how I killed a man. Wait, we're starting?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
And that was the tamest way you could have said that as well.
All right. Hello, everybody. I am Kyle. The GM is Quest Friends. That's the channel you're on. And today, welcome to Visions of a Ninth World, where a bunch of actual plays got together and decided we're going to talk about Numenera. Because we're basically experts at this point. So we're just going to go around, introduce ourselves, and then I'll kind of explain what the plan for today is. So I'm Kyle. I'm the GM of Quest Friends. If anyone wants to pop in and introduce themselves, unless you want me to say your name.
Oh, okay. I'm Jesus of the Fandible podcast and the main GM for our long-running Numenera game.
Megan, who are you?
Hey, I'm Megan. I'm the GM for the Amber Clave, and I run a Numenera and a bunch of other things on the redacted files, but Amber Clave is where we just do all Numenera all the time.
Okay. And then Tesla.
Okay, I'm Tesla from the R.P.G lab. We do Numenera every Wednesday, and I've also got about 4 years streaming experience of it as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I've heard a thing about my voice being in your left earphone. I'll get to that when other people are answering questions, because that's what we're doing today. We're talking about questions. So this is Visions of a Ninth World. We decide we're all going to get together, and we're just going to talk anything and everything about Numenera. And kind of like how we run it and how we take this book, which I have handily here as a prop, and we turn it into stories for our playing and your listening or viewing, in the case of the RPG Lab, pleasure. So I've got a couple of questions queued up. We're just kind of go around, but feel free if you have anything you want us to talk about or have any thoughts of your own to mention them in chat. I also have a little Google form here that I'm going to put in the chat that I'll be keeping an eye on in case, you want something that, if you really want to ask something and you don't want me to miss it, typing it in that form is the best way to guarantee that I see it before we're done here today. So we'll go until we stop. So, but before we start, I want to start with the first question, which I think is the most pressing one for any sort of Numenera podcast. Is there's a lot of systems out there, so why Numenera? Why did you decide to go with that system, go with that world? What really struck out about Monte Cook Games' game? Anyone want?
I'll let the podcasters go first.
Okay. Well, it was two reasons for me. First off, it was a fairly, at least from a first skimming, a fairly easy rule set, straight D20 plus difficulties going up and down in threes. But the main reason was mainly the world. I like real worlds. I was a huge fan of Planescape when Monte Cook and his team created that years ago. And when Numenera came up, I said, yes, please, let's make this as weird and bizarre as possible. And I somehow convinced my players to go with it.
I've actually never played a lot of straight up D&D, so I sort of came into role playing through Rogue Trader, and I don't remember how I even heard about Numenera the first time, but science fantasy has always been something that I really love, and so Numenera just hit all my sweet spots for world setting, and the rules are just really great, and I love them. So that's why we started playing it the first time, and then my continued love for Numenera is why we turned it into a separate podcast, because I just wanted to run it all the time.
So for me, Numenera, I started with my first game that I ever played. We're gonna go just far back in history here. Was Pathfinder, which for someone coming in just wanting to basically do improv was not necessarily the best fit. But my second game was The Strange, which compared to my Pathfinder experience was much more what I was looking for, and it really made me fall in love with the Cypher Systems games and universe. So I did that, and then I did a bunch of one-shots in just general Cypher System rules, And the basic reason we followed Numenera was my first full campaign. I wanted to do a Cypher System game, and I think we have this kind of unspoken rule among our friends that we don't do the same system twice. There are just so many out there that we want to try that we'll do our one campaign, we're happy with that, we want to move on to something else. So I wanted to do a Cypher System game, and you can basically blame Tom, who's one of my players, who apparently had a character for a long time that he really wanted to play in this game, which is Shock in our podcast, and he really wanted to play it, and he basically told me, "Hey, what if magic, but technology?" And that sentence, I was like, "What if magic, but technology?" So it was something that Tom really wanted to play. It was a system I wanted to make something for, and it was a world that I really liked, because I'm not a big fan of classical fantasy, but I'm a big fan of tech. But I'm not a big fan of like the crunch of sci-fi. So like Numenera was just a nice mix of all of that together, and so that's why we ended up going with that. All right. Tesla, you're muted.
Tesla is muted, so
There we go. Right,
there we go.
Right, there we go. She's got a loud keyboard, so. My way of coming to this is a little bit more convoluted.
Mhm.
Okay, so I started off watching a lot of real roleplay, and I was getting into their Stars Without Numbers, so I was already in the sci-fi mood, and we got to, a bunch of us who are usually early to the stream were like, we've not played before, we've not been part of any sort of stream or any sort of role play before, and someone in the chat offered to play, so we decided to play, and let's just say that there was a lot of disagreements with how the game was being run to the way that the players wanted it to be run. And so I thought, well, I do story writing for a degree. So I've got a literature and creative writing degree. So I thought, well, I can do the story aspect of it. I just need a framework that's very easy to work with, that I already have a few touchstones with. And they were also doing at the time the special of their Numenera special. And I was just like, okay, well, it ticks the sci-fi box that I was wanting. It gives me all the fantasy bits and bobs that I know that I can work with. It's got a lovely system that's very easy to work with and homebrew off against. And it's got a great system setting book, which just has a lot of story seeds and touchstones that you can easily draw off of. So even though it might not be as easy to refer to a few things to classical D&D players, like there's no such thing as a dwarf in certain respects, they'll certainly easily get it, and as long as you've got a bit of an imagination on you, anything's possible in that system. So I just thought, if it's going to be my first system, it needs to be something that I can mess up on and I can mold with and do a bit of creativity with and not feel stifled behind by all the rules and sort of all the specifics. So that's how I ended up there, and haven't stopped since.
Super cool. Well, our mention of D&D a couple of times, I think, naturally leads into this question, even if our mention of D&D is that we don't know much about D&D. One of our questions was by a single leaf, because we had a whole pile of leaves ask questions.
Okay.
A single leaf.
Weird. I appreciate it.
A single leaf had asked us, what do you think, for those of us familiar with D&D, the biggest difference between making things in D&D and making things in Numenera?
Okay, right, I do 16 D shows a week and Numenera once a week, so I think I've got a bit of a, for me at least, I can kind of tell it's D&D for me. There's, although you can do a lot of interesting homebrew and your own ideas with it, for me there's a very strict set of, there's a framework that you go off of. And there's usually a set of established sort of, if one thing happens like this, then another thing should happen like this. And it makes it very easy for you to just go, right, if I just want to do this type of thing, it's going to be this, this, and this. In fact, actually over on the website, I actually converted the Sliderkin over from Numenera, because they're one of my favorites creatures, and I actually put them in D&D. So I actually kind of had to look at what the differences were between the two. And it was very much sort of like, this creature is going to be like this, but with this, but with this. It was more sort of like doing one of those fold over creatures that you do on a piece of paper, cobble together jumble. But because there were certain established ways of how things function, that's how it was meant to work. Whereas if you take an approach when you look at Numenera and the Cypher system, that's all out the window. what you've got is your own imagination and a very bare bones set of rules saying that if you want to achieve something, then it's going to be a little bit like this, and you get to decide the rest of it all. And for me, it's that freedom of interpretation and creativity, and how easy you can adapt and change a situation without having to make sure that it's going to fit with what everything else is established, because you know that whatever you do, it's going to work.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
Yeah.
I haven't GM'd D&D before, but I know one of my biggest fears about it would be creating NPCs on the fly. I think anyone who's played one of my games knows that probably one of my biggest downfalls is combat. Just combat tends to go topsy-turvy, upside down, left and right. And one of the things I appreciate about Numenera is that it's very simple combat for enemies. It's you give them a level, you give them hit points, you can give them a strength, but they already have systems for giving them a striking point. And I'd be a lot less comfortable because from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, D&D monsters, they have the same stats that players do, right? They have the strength, dexterity, intelligence.
Yeah.
So that's you got to give 6 stats. You can still figure them out on the fly, but you got to give 6 stats to every potential NPC you're going to face, as opposed to the kinds I make in Numenera, which is generally here's their base stat, and then I'll make them specialized in one thing. So there's that separation, but it's a lot easier to piece it together.
Cool. I'm just going to build on what Tesla basically said. In the world of Numenera, D&D, like he said, there's certain tropes. There's dwarves and elves, and even other universes, there's sometimes deviations of those tropes, but you can still see the framework of what was previously there. With Numenera, in the story, there's 1 billion years of history, 1 billion years of different civilization, different alien races, different human civilizations, for all you know, each with distinct ways of looking at the world, some utterly alien from what you could think. So you could literally have a world where pieces of civilization that believes that fluffy dogs were the constant of the universe, next to a person who thinks, well, rocks are nice. Combine them and form the weirdest and most bizarre things, and it would just fit that world entirely, which I love. I love randomness in my games. I do random stuff in the game all the time because I know it will work every single time. Well, 99% of the time. 98. One of those numbers.
A high number.
Yeah, it's high.
Yeah, I don't know if I have that much to add. I just love with Numenera how easy it's just easy to pick up and go, because I do a lot of prep and reading for a lot of the games that I run in other systems, and you have to pull out all your monster stats and have everything laid out in front of you and look at those huge stupid spell lists, which was my least favorite part of Pathfinder when I was running a wizard to attack the party. But with Numenera, all I have to do is think of a number and think of a creature to go with it that's a little weird, and then I'm ready to go with my adventure for the group.
Yeah, it's I know for me, the actual levels of enemies and stuff usually don't even show up in planning. It's all story-based things I want to hit. So we've kind of talked about the flexibility that Numenera offers, and I remember before we started filming, we talked about this book. And one thing that one of my castmate members asked beforehand, which I think is a very interesting question, especially considering conversation, is kind of you can go a whole bunch of ways with it, but the core of the question is, what is your relationship with this book? How do you go about, taking the things that are inside? Well, I mean, this is the old Numenera book, but inside one of the Numenera books, because they have a whole bunch, and kind of transforming it into a game. Do you take it how it appears face level? Do you just add in your own things? What's your relationship to how do you adapt Numenera as written into Numenera as played, if that makes sense?
Well, for me, at least, my friends, when we first played it, joked at the time that basically us and rules aren't always a thing. We're getting slowly better at it as the rules go on, but we're trying to get more into the rules. But the main point of the book, at least in our opinion, is it's great for story seeds. It's great for grabbing bits and pieces and making our own little strange bit of the universe into that world. And we just love playing with that.
I really love how each section, like if you're going through that or the Ninth World Guidebook and you're looking at the different areas that are known in the Steadfast, they have like rumors and like little story hooks in each of those. That's almost all I read about any region is like those little bits that are there to give you ideas. And there's a lot of really great ideas in those. That's my main relationship with the book. I guess we have been doing our first season is almost all underwater, so I actually read a lot more extensively in Into the Deep because I wanted to get some ideas there, and then that helped me figure out what I needed to put in communities to build our own sort of underwater places for people to encounter. But still, I think the most valuable part in any of those sections is just the story hooks.
Yeah, well, with my setting, because I was also using it for my community as an introduction to RPGs as well, because quite a few of them hadn't gone through, found D&D to be a little more intimidating, whereas the simplicity of the system, of the Cypher system, is very easy to bring people in, and usually within sort of 5 to 10 minutes of gameplay, they've gone, oh, that's how that works, okay, and then they're fine for the entire rest of the game. Me trying to shoot myself in the foot, I took all of what I liked about, because I did about 2 years worth of working with the core book as a setting manual and setting it in one particular part in Thamor and looking at sort of the history and then building around what was in the book and creating my own narrative to link everything together. When it came to doing a new season, I felt that I had sort of exhausted my relationship. I suppose it's because I went quite deep into the whole system and into the sort of the setting that I felt like I needed a fresh approach. And I really liked the whole idea of the Ninth World. But I thought, could you try to at least condense it into a space you can walk from one end to the other in one day?
Oh, okay.
And so that's how the city of Otranto came about. It's essentially the world of Numenera and all this weird and wonderfulness all condensed down into a floating island.
Yeah. The Ninth World I find very interesting because, especially off of what Jesus and Megan said, is it's very similar. The book is like a setting book, but it feels kind of like a brainstorming book. Like it just bombards you with ideas to kind of expand upon. And I just find it interesting because the Ninth World feels so distinct. Like I could look at something and be like, this is the Ninth World if someone showed me something without any hesitation. It's like it creates such a vibrant world, but it also allows flexibility where when you're in the Ninth World, but no Ninth World feels the same as the next. It's very interesting because, like, for example, if I took the Ninth World as appears your quest friends versus how I imagine it, kind of based on the book, completely 100% opposite side of the world universes. Yet if you looked at both of them, I think you could say, well, obviously if you look at the core book, you could say that's Numenera because it's titled Numenera. But I like to believe if you look at mine, you're like, oh, that's Numenera too. And I think there's an interesting breadth it allows. It feels like Numenera really focuses for me on breadth, and then it's up to me to create kind of that depth to it, if that makes sense.
Well, and what's really great is that they've set up the world so we only have a map of like 1/4 of the whole world. So you can put whatever you want on the rest of the 3/4 of the world and out in the ocean because they've left that open for you as a GM to fill as you want.
Yeah. Tom will remind me at length that whenever I say, oh, the Jagged Dream is threatening the world and is going to destroy the world, he's like, no. That's just the Steadfast. There's a lot more to the world. And I'm like, okay, Tom, the world as we know it. Whatever.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much worse out there. Let me list it.
Let me. Probably better to just list the things that aren't worse outside of the Ninth World. Oh no, Tom's defending himself in chat. You're fine, Tom. I appreciate your reminders. All right. Let's go back to another question that somebody somebody asked us, which is actually since we kind of talked about inspiration, let's just get on that plagiarism train. Have you ever seen something or heard an idea? And this is from 3 Leaves, so this is back to the pile of leaves asking another question. Have you ever seen something or heard an idea that you immediately had to put into one of your games?
The entirety of the movie Annihilation. I haven't managed to fit a lot of that movie into my games yet, but I was watching it and I was like, this is the 9th world.
I think...
okay, sorry.
I think for me, it's more... I think it's just very small individual things that I just remember, but I can't remember the context for them. And I go, I must have seen that somewhere, otherwise I am probably going mad. Because it's that sort of... When you start thinking of stuff for the 9th world, it is literally like the most weird thing. And I've got like... I don't know where it came from, but I must have seen something similar. It was a helmet, but it was the texture and the consistency of a jellyfish.
I like that.
So as they put it on, the sort of like just went over their head a bit further down, so it had like the visor type effect. But it was just this gelatinous, and it was... Let's just say one of our characters who likes to be very prim and proper outright refused to use it.
For me, it's nothing I can think of specifically. I like to read a lot of like science articles and science journals just because I like to read them, but also because it gives me random ideas. So a lot of the stuff I put into the game is just random ideas from that stuff, from those journals and stuff like that. But nothing specifically comes to mind in this instant.
One of my favorite things about fantasy, which is why I really like the TV show Gravity Falls, is taking the fantastical and making it just feel mundane, and conversely taking the mundane and making it feel fantastical. So my ideas come from generally one of 3 sources. If you're any of our listeners, I promise I have not stolen most of our plot from the Adventure Zone, but it probably looks like I have. I started because I came up with the whole story about Arc 2, and then I reached every other arc, and I'm like, this is Chapter 4. This is going to be my Chapter 3. Great, I just stole everything. I take a lot of inspiration from Parks and Rec, because one of our characters based their character off of Ben Wyatt from Parks and Rec, so I just did I basically twisted any sort of things from that. But it's mostly taking a look at something in the real world and being like, how can I take basically the physical version of this, or like the name, or like how can I tangentially get off of it as much as I can. But generally it's real objects. Like, I'm gonna copy this image address. Like, I have an upcoming thing that's basically like, those at least when I was a kid, there were these like pin toys. They were like, it was like a sheet of pins, and if you put something into it, it would make the shape of that, so you almost always stuck your face into it.
Mm-hmm.
I just remembered that one day, and I'm like, what if that but technology?
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically my philosophy for creating Numenera. I look at something and say, what if that but technology?
Oh, I've got it. I've got one thing. In our group, whenever we get frustrated with a game or something like that, it's like, we always kind of joke, like, okay, can I just recreate my character? Can I make a bard? Can I just make a bard? Because it's from an old joke from one of the Pathfinder, where we got so frustrated with Pathfinder, where everyone wanted to just die and create bards and say, screw it. And basically, I decided to try to put that into our Numenera game somehow. So I actually created an artifact, a mask that when you put on gave you bonuses to performance. And eventually the mask evolved because it got into one of the players where basically like you can't take it off until people clap. So if you fail a performance, or you've got this like ridiculous masquerade mask on your face walking around until you can convince someone to like what you do.
That's horrifying, and I love it. Oh.
Yep.
All right, let's pull up another one here. Let's go. I'm trying to think of a good one to kind of bounce off what we've been saying here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's go to this one because we're gonna hit this one eventually. So we might as well hit it. Do you have any advice for someone new to GMing who wants to run a Numenera one shot? And that is from Emsley's.
My advice, especially if you've never if you're from more traditional, say Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, you're trying to get into weirdness of Numenera game. If you want to run a one shot, create the characters, create a if you've done this before in the other games, like create a random normal town and then add 2 or 3 weird stuff. And you can go and find a generator somewhere of like, put in a tree that hums at midnight. Put in floating balls that if you touch them scream. Something just random weird stuff. Put them to town and people in the town treat it as normal. And then slowly like make it part of the story, make it just part of the random weirdness of that particular area. And that's a good way to lean into like how strange and bizarre this world is.
Yeah.
Jade Colossus is a great resource for random weirdness like that. It's meant to build out dungeons, but I steal from it all the time now.
Yeah, Monica Games I know makes a bunch of stuff designed for first time GMs. So I've heard it's always good to start off with a module. I never did that, but I hear it's good to start off like that. But I agree completely. The way I go about it is what I said earlier. Take one thing and say, what if this but technology? And the main reason I think that is, first off, it gives the weirdness a frame of reference for the players. But it's when you get into the thick of the weird, especially as a creator, it's going to be, at least in my opinion, very easy to make something that is super weird that you can't quite explain, but because you spent a lot of time thinking about it, is very intricate. Mm-hmm. And because I know I fall into that pit, and I think that's when you're going to kind of lose players. So I think if you start with something, very simple, weird things, it'll ease your players into the idea of the weird of Numenera, but it'll also ease you into creating things that are weird, but still things still you can manipulate, things that the players can understand and isn't too far beyond not only their understanding but your ability to describe things.
So basically, what you're saying, like weird but consistent.
Yeah,
like everything sort of fits.
Yeah.
With my advice would probably be, which I actually found was quite helpful, is to you take a familiar concept you have now, and then what if it was represented differently? So take the idea of the internet, like wire cables transferring data. What if they're not cables transferring data? What if they're rivers? Same sort of idea. And then if you think about, if a river is what's what's connecting data between two things, then what are those two things? They must be like the size of mountains, or they've got something associated. So maybe the way that it takes up the information is like a water wheel with buckets. And instead of it being put into a machine, and it's all this sort of just reimagining something very simple, such as like a cable transferring data, and trying to make it something that's that can be seen or touched or felt or smelt, and that it wouldn't usually be able to. And then at least you have, as a GM, you've got a touchstone to know what you're basically describing, but you've got a way of obfuscating what you're referring to through the lens of the Ninth World.
Yeah, I know for me, if I'm feeling particularly, I don't want to say lazy with naming, but no, I mean lazy. If I feel lazy with naming, something I'll do is I will take an object, like a water bottle, and I will just apply a word in front of it that makes it weird. So now we've got the magma bottle. It's a water bottle with magma. I don't know. That was the first thing that popped into my mind. But I found for me it's first off easy for naming, but when you're first trying to make things, taking, as I said, taking the wires and reinterpreting it in a new way, which an easy way for me is just take an object and apply an adjective to it. Just Mad Libs it till you hit something that seems neat, and then just kind of think about what that might sound like, what that might feel like.
Cool.
So,
I was just gonna second. I learned how to GM by running pre-written stuff, and I know some people are like, you have to create your own world and blah blah blah. But I love modules, and they really help you sort of get a feel of how to pace your stories and build things out. And you can still customize things inside those. And you can let your players go off and do the weird stuff and break completely away from the module. No one's going to care. There's not like a module police making sure you stay 100% within the confines of what was written on the page for you. And also, GM intrusions don't just have to be for bad things. Like if your players aren't picking up on a clue, you can find a way to turn that clue into GM intrusion and give that to them through that. And then they're getting an XP, and maybe something a little bad might happen, but it doesn't have to be something that's bad.
Yeah. Building on that, if you can't help them fail forward, if they're not able to make something, GM intrusions are a great way of helping with that, because it's a backhanded compliment. Essentially, it's like, look, you're doing really well, but yeah, this is where you need to go. But
maybe do well in a different way.
Yeah, maybe I'll just set this part of the room on fire so that you'll go to the other part of the room.
It makes me think of like so they always say avoid railroading, so maybe I'll think of a good game as like a highway. I like to think of GM intrusions as sometimes carefully put down roadblocks. Where it's like a character's like, I really want to do this, and I'm like, I really don't want you to. And it's also a fun way to like, one of my characters, their whole character arc, until such point that it actually becomes relevant in the game, which will be a year and a half from now. I'm sorry, Ari. I just GM intrusion. I just GM intrusion to bring up that plot point, and then let us move on. I really like GM intrusions. They're great.
Yeah, I've had one of my players end up finding out that he was a clone.
No.
And he's not the only surprise. You're a clone. It's complicated the story. Technically, it's not a negative thing, but yeah. There you go. Yeah. It also sort of like it sort of allows you to, if you have players, I think is with GM intrusions, if you're from the GM standpoint, you've got to be a little careful with who you're giving certain types of intrusions to. Because some players you can give them anything. I know that I have a few players that will very much appreciate being given something completely off the wall to deal with. But I know that there are some other players that perhaps be a little bit more sensitive to certain things that are going on with their characters. So I think with that sort of thing, it's also about, because Numenera, you can just do everything, most of it on the fly. It's also the biggest then sort of the real hurdle is knowing your players and going, this is what they're happy to deal with. This is what's slightly at the edge of their comfort zone, and just knowing where to push and where not, when to keep things safe with those GM intrusions, because you don't want them to constantly go, right, this is going to ruin everything. Refuse.
Yeah, I'm actually.
And then you end up just the mechanic ends up just becoming a bit laborious.
That's actually something I'd love to talk about, is kind of your relationship with GM intrusions, and to another lesser extent maybe experience, because I found that seems to waver a lot throughout games. Like, I had to remove experience as leveling up rights from my players. They just don't get that privilege anymore because they never used it for anything else. And I'm the same. We were all horrible XP misers, so I eventually had to be like, no, you're just gonna level up when the plot tells you to level up, and you're gonna have to use these experience points to do cool things. But I'm also curious with GM intrusions, because like with Tesla, when you mentioned that you have to be careful with that. One nice thing about my players and our relationship is that we're all very dramatic people. We like things going wrong. We enjoy pain. So, like with our players, we even have a house rule where they can't refuse a GM intrusion. We all agree that we unless it's one of those X card moments where it's like it makes someone genuinely uncomfortable. We just house rule that you can't.
Interesting.
Oh, I might do that for next season.
That's what we never do.
Yeah.
We never refuse them anyway. So just for the sake of the podcast, I was like, let's just make it so that you never can. And it's worked out really well, because I think for me, my players enjoy it most when they get GM intrusions because, as I said, they love seeing their beautiful children in horrible pain, as I'm sure Hallie can attest to.
Yeah, Kyle, I'm glad that you and I are the both same type of monster. Basically, like when I first started the Numenera game, I decided right off the bat, points are not going to be used for XP. I wanted everyone on the same level, and B, things like every new tier that has to be a momentous occasion, like something important in the story happens, and that's why you're moving on. So generally, every 1 or 2 episodes, everyone goes up, not tier, in advance. That's the stories, and also with GM intrusions, like your group, my group loves failure because failure always brings about interesting story moments, interesting, very hilarious story moments, and that's what we just enjoy doing and messing around. There was one where one of our players is an assassin. Like that was his life before he joined the group and started going on a good path. I say with quotation marks. And he basically went into a house, didn't trust a woman, and basically rolled a nat 1 and basically was convinced this nice old woman was an assassin. And that went to a whole series of events that were basically by the end he was about to kill her, and then the entire time the old woman thought he was seducing her. It was great. It was a great moment all around. And failure is the best thing in any game, but especially in this game if you play it right.
Yeah.
We also do not let you use XP to level up on Amber Clave, mostly because when Acer ran the Strange, he handed out XP really quickly, and we were at like level 5 by episode 15. Ooh. And when I ran Numenera, they were like level 5 or 6 by episode 25, and like this is just going way too quick because they weren't spending their XP for rerolls or for anything else. And so I sort of expanded what you could use XP for in our game a little bit and said, I will tell you when you're moving up because I wanted a little bit more control over that within the group.
Yeah, I felt that initially players do hoard their XP, but there's also the incentive from the GM's point to keep giving out those intrusions, and that sort of that becomes almost like a leveling up engine if neither side decides to realize that sort of if you keep feeding one into the other, your players are just going to be out of control within 5 minutes of you giving them XP. So I've also divided the GM intrusions from that. And again, like Sean, I've updated all of the way you can spend XP, so there's a little bit more of an expansion on that, so that you're not just tied down to what's already in there. Because it is, again, there are certain ways you can add in extra bits and bobs to make it a little bit more flexible. But the way I love doing it for me, for the way that I put in my intrusions, is that I don't just say, oh, here's, you take 1 XP into one of a friend. I try and sneak it into the conversation. So just like, so you're looking down this deep, dark hole, and right down at the very bottom, slightly submerged under what looks to be like dirty water, is 1 XP to you and a friend.
Oh no!
Subtle, like it.
Oh.
So that's how I tend to do it, and it's become a thing that they're not. So I don't let. So you never know when it's coming. So my players always have to hold on to at least 1 or 2 XP just in case they get caught out, because usually it is at the critical moment that they want to achieve something, and I'm just going, but then what if this happens? No, I want this to happen. Please don't. It's become now more sort of bargaining chips. Stop me from stop me from adding too many complications. It's not that they don't like it. It's that they just want for once thing to just go from A to B in one straight, simple line.
I wouldn't do that because I take too much pleasure of very loudly announcing that a GM intrusion is coming. But I take a lot of pleasure. I am basically my villains.
Yeah.
So since we talked about that XP change, it actually brings up something that I want to talk about, mostly because I just want to rant about something.
Oh God.
We'll get to it. So we've talked about, we've done a lot of obviously adjustments on the Ninth World, and with XP and GM intrusions, we've all made one very strong change to experience points. But is there anything Probably more from a world building standpoint, either for the aesthetic of your game, like the kind of tone you're going for, or for other personal reasons that you felt you've kind of had to change from the core rulebook. And if no one has anything on the fly and they want to,
I've like I said, I've homebrewed the entire. I've tried to at least take the bits and pieces from the ninth world that I liked, and I shoved it all in a very small setting, even sort of creating the intranet of the datasphere, and so that it's the same concept but disconnected from the rest of the world, so that eventually, if the players do head down that route, they can reconnect to the rest of the sort of the information network. But everything that they do, everything that they see and hear is all connected to the setting they're in, so they can't sort of, they don't really know that there's a lot outside, but there's a lot of references because it is based off sort of historically. It's based off of a floating city, essentially, which then died out and then became an island and then was recolonized, and the city was then turned back on again, essentially. So all they know is what the city did at the time, X hundreds, thousands, millions of years ago. So they understand that there is a wider world out there, but they only have experience with what's they have. So it allows me to control going, oh yeah, I'll just have that thing that I like from this part of the world, and it's just going to turn up there. And although it does a little bit, there is context to it, it allows me to sort of cherry pick what I like from the ninth world and put it into more of a context that fits with the current setting than having them to go to specific areas to experience some of the weird and wonderful. I can just have it happen down the corridor.
I'm just gonna get my rant out of the way, so I'm not waiting for it, and so not everyone doesn't have to wait for it. But I really like Numenera. I have major beef with one part of it, and that's the abhumans. I'm mostly conceptually they're from what I understand they're mutated humans who are basically turned into these kind of like inhuman monsters, essentially creatures, essentially like for the way I read it is an excuse to make humanoid monsters for you to fight. And I think it's largely the term that made me very uncomfortable, because abhuman sounds to me very, very close to subhuman. And when I get to subhuman, because it's this idea that it's like they're humans but not really, so it's okay to kill them. And like for me that just carried a bunch of just like oppression metaphors and stories, like just with the term especially, that just kind of it just flew in my face, and it was something that I couldn't get past, and I was like, if I keep abhumans in here, that's going to have to be a plot point, and that's not a plot point I am comfortable running. It doesn't fit the tone of our game, and obviously I am not the kind of person to be telling those stories. So it really struck me out. So I basically in the ninth world, as it is in Quest Friends, abhumans just don't exist, and I've replaced them all with visitants. Because when you have aliens, there's this degree of separation, and it allows me to be more flexible. Like, it allows me to add, like, a Rorothic, which I really like them. I think they look super cool. But a Rorothic who's just like, that guy who hangs out at the coffee cooler, he's a little addicted to murder, but, besides that, he's just friendly neighborhood regular Bob. And I found that removing abhumans has not only got away from that human but not really idea that it just doesn't feel right to me, but it's also allowed me to really give more life to what are otherwise just monsters on two legs.
To be honest, if you were to transfer that same name scheme over to say something like D&D, everything that's not human, pink skin or whatever type of skin, with the normal ears, the normal eyes, the normal hair, normal height, every other race in D&D would be considered under that an abhuman. And yeah, if you then sort of start comparing it, then in that sort of context, it just doesn't sound right, because they are races in their own right. They're not abhuman, they're humanoid comparatively, but they're not it's I guess it's sort of the human centric sort of viewpoint on that. It's going compared to the humans in this world, they're not normal, but the humans compared to them are not normal. So really, I guess because if you're taking it from the standpoint that these are humans that have mutated in some form and changed over the years, they're humanoid. If they, for me, abhuman, it doesn't sound, for me, again, it doesn't sound on the nose. That should be the right description for me.
And
I think.
And when you think of that's an issue, actually, I haven't even thought about it that way. But when you think about it, like with the history of the universe, like a billion years of history, some of those abhumans may have been humans from a previous civilization that fell, and now you're treating them like garbage because you didn't make it, buddies.
Yeah, to me, they should just be humanoids, because you can be those races, and by the Nightfall rolls around, and some of those races are just fully established as their own kind now. And to me, if you can play one of those races as an option, everything else should be ab-murden or ab-mutants. It's that sort of thing. Like, although I'm leaving all of those humanoid races for my next season, because spoilers, there's going to be a big change in their setting in the future. But at the moment, I just have mutants because mine's a little bit more sci-fi and urban based. So I had sort of the idea of mutants and that type of thing as their introduction to other forms of humanoid, and then they're going to get a huge culture shock in season 2.
Cool. For me, it's more of an overall thing where I'm basically as my characters are tearing up, they're beginning to realize that a lot of their movements, a lot of their actions in life are being manipulated by higher powers. And I'm basically interested in concepts like there's a billion years of history, there's a billion years of superior civilizations that have evolved to points that are beyond gods and men. Where basically but the thing is, there's so many different ones that are fighting against each other, where weirdly enough, because there's so many conflicting higher powers trying to manipulate people actually have free will because of it. So they actually get to choose which higher power they fight with. So I'm interested in this overall concept of the god plane of Numenera, slowly.
Makes sense. Anything you've drastically wanted to change, Megan?
No, not really. Yeah, I don't have anything really to add to that.
Okay, cool. All right, I got a couple more. I'm going to do the last of the major ones. We've hit Emsley's, we hit Two Leaves, but now we have Anne. We had one other person who asked a big question, and this is going to be our most massive deviation from what we've been talking about. But it does kind of reflect the one thing we haven't discussed yet today. We are actual plays. We are games that are either streamed or recorded for the sake of people to listen to. And so the question that Anne asked was, how do you feel about fan interaction in general, and then how listeners interact with your specific shows? And then on a further extent, do you try to do things to encourage that, or just kind of what's your relationship with your listener base, if that makes sense?
I can't speak for everyone else, but I love listening to the fans. I love commenting when they comment and we answer back. We have our own Discord where we discuss aspects of the story, ideas they may have. We just love interacting and do the people that for some odd reason like to listen to us every week. We still have not figured out why they keep coming back.
And then we all nominate. Well, I guess you nominated yourself for an Annie, but we all voted.
Oh, thank you all so much for that, by the way. Sad I didn't win, but you know what? Next time.
Next time. I'll vote twice as hard.
Next time you'll be the only nominee by the time it ends.
Oh, trust me, there are plans.
I really like the relationship we have with our listeners. We got a whole influx after the Adventures. We did an Adventure Zone promo. Because I was like, oh, the people who listen to that probably are people who would like our show. And luckily I was right. And because we got a lot of influx from that. And I really like the relationship we have. I don't know if I would ever do a Discord. Because I do I like being able to have that direct interaction, but I know there can be a great discomfort on both sides if it gets a little too intimate at times. And so and I'm relatively new. This is the first time I've made something that anyone other than my friends has like cared about listening to. So I'm still trying to figure it out because it's only been. I mean, we've had commenters, but we've only had like an influx of commenters for the past like month and a half, maybe. But I'd say the one thing that I really do like about fan interaction is I love two things about the fans. I love how passionate they are about listening to and engaging with the story and adding to the story. We have a massive influx on Archive of our own. The Numenera tag, I'm sorry guys, it's Quest Friends. We've taken it over. It is us now. And I really get excited because it's fun. It's fun to see how people, when you see someone write a character, you really get to see what they think of that character and how they think it acts. And I really enjoy seeing what people feel about the characters, like how like the kind of emotional investment they get, but also like seeing what they interpret them as. And the other thing that I absolutely love about interaction, and I want to encourage, because I did ask about encouraging, the one thing I want to encourage our fan base 100% more, keep torturing Hallie about Lorraine, because we've got a long time before that's not going to be a pain point for her. And like we've had a lot of fiction where people have made jokes and then referenced how it's going to bother Hallie. And I just want to, for any of you listening, it does. It's working. Keep going. All right, I'll let it off to everyone else.
Yeah. Since we do a live stream, we're a bit more. Well, there's two types, sort of a few different types of sort of live streams over on Twitch that deal with actual plays, live plays. And I noticed that some of them are literally just you are watching people playing, and you will get interacted with after the stream, or it's incorporated into the actual stream itself, so either via donations or bits or whatever, bits and pieces like that to encourage it. And I fall on the latter side of things because if you're listening to a podcast, you're doing other things, or you've got the opportunity to do something else while you're listening. If you're tuning into a stream, you're watching people, and if you want to keep them watching and to actively engage with the stream, then there needs to at least be some sort of opportunity for them to do so. So for me, I've got a bit of current channel currency, which can alter dice and how that affects game. I have specifically a Twitch only a command for the Numenera game, which allows the Twitch chat to do an intrusion. It's a sort of a slightly sort of like it's sort of based off of what you get off normal dice rolls, just transferring it to a player, but it allows sort of Twitch chat to sort of like a damn them roll. They keep going. They sort of have the option to then also have viewer decisions if there's enough sort of social media or presence that they then get to directly influence the game itself by making suggestions. And also over on our Discord channel, we take all manner of suggestions and NPC options and other bits and pieces and try to put that in as well. So I think it's just because the lab is pretty based off of its community, so we're trying to use as much community interaction as possible, which is quite hectic when you're trying to plan things and you kind of go, okay, right, now they've got 3 puppies and a direwolf. Right. They're level 1. Okay, that's what you want. Well, that's what you. How am I gonna deal with this? But yeah, I think really it's sort of when it comes to sort of interaction with your audience, it's really based off of your format. If you're going to be a lot more reactive when it comes to something that's already curated and then published out, whereas a live format, you've got to kind of really try to grab them while they're there.
Yeah.
I think for me, interaction with fans is something that's really validating because a lot of times it feels like you're just like shouting into the void with podcasts, and you can like look at your download numbers, but otherwise you're just like, I hope everyone likes this. And then if you don't hear it back, you're like, I guess it's okay. But you don't get like any feedback. So anytime anyone like replies to tweets or tweets at me or the podcast about something they liked, it really makes my day.
Yeah.
And I love talking to people on Twitter. So please talk to me on Twitter.
Yeah, I get the same. Like, there's a couple of games, like, for a couple of days, there's no comments or anything, and there's nothing on Twitter. Like, Did people like the game? Did I offend someone? What's going on, guys? Come on, I need this.
See, I think that's definitely where the sort of the differences between the live stream and that sort of format is that we get that validation, if there is validation at that point, there and then on the stream. But then you kind of like have to worry about getting the people there then. Whereas at least when you've put your content out, at least you've got time for people to accumulate. And although it may not be instant, at least you kind of know when you're going to get enough people to get some feedback. Whereas sometimes when you're sat there on stream, you are literally shouting out into the void and you know it.
Yeah, kind of hopping back to social media. Yeah, I agree 100% with the validation and stuff, because like my basic policy for replying is if you @quest friends and occasionally if you #quest friends, or if you're somebody I talk to a lot and I know you're like comfortable interacting with us, I will reply to you using the Twitter account. But I never want to reply to someone who hasn't specific, like if they @me, they basically, I interpret that as I'm painting a target on my back is a bad way of saying it, but like I'm okay with you interacting with me, but if someone does something other, I don't want to assume that they're comfortable with us responding. That being said, I do know the folks who like live stream their reactions to the episodes, and I absolutely have those Twitter accounts pulled up the second we release. Because it's fun to see cute. Like it's fun to see not only how people react, but it's also fun to see like what they react to. Because sometimes it's exactly what I expect, but it's. I think that's one of the most fun things about that and about reviews is that like you start to learn. You think you know what's great about your story and what's valuable to listeners, but I've never really learned. Sometimes I'm right, and I've gotten better at predicting, but it's always fun to see what people attach onto, because sometimes it's things that are just random, just thrown out of the blue, and suddenly that gets super attached to, and I'm like, okay.
I think it must be nice for you guys because you get the opportunity for people to make those comments after they've listened to the entirety or after they've got through a significant portion where they feel like they want to comment. And so they've got, or you can kind of go, oh, they're putting all of their sort of experience with what you've done and then making their comment. Where if you're doing it live, it could be that they like that little bit and it's just that one person at that one point. And then you kind of realize that sort of you don't really get to have that overall viewpoint because you're literally viewing it as it goes. If they react, then they react, but they might, after they've gone, I go, oh, that was really good. But you don't get the opportunity to then have that feedback because either they have to come over to another way to communicate it with you because you don't have that feedback form where you can put it up on that sort of hosting sites and have people make that comment. So we have to put it getting onto your own sort of social media and sort of community side of things. So yeah, you can with his live stream, you can never really tell how well it's going or what people are really enjoying because you're viewing it at the time, which is I would like to know if someone did like the entirety of something rather than staying for 5 minutes liking what they saw and then leaving.
Yeah, no, I get that. I was lucky that my only live stream was in a Discord group, so like I was able to hear from the group afterwards because the audience was basically everyone in that group.
Nice.
All right, so just for the sake of the folks listening, folks viewing, not listening, this isn't a podcast for once. I'm actually, you can see my face. I'm kind of almost exhausted the questions that I've gotten. So if you have any questions, I'm gonna pop that form down there again because that's gonna be my easiest way of looking at it. Feel free to pop down so we can kind of streamline through a few of them. But while we wait, does anyone have anything they want to talk about? And then
I have a question for the table.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite or go-to / basic framework NPC that you fall back on or you use, shall we say, in more than one scenario? Have you had sort of like a reoccurring NPC for whatever reason?
If people can't hear me right now, I have to print off something in answer to that, so I might be muted for a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, right.
Okay. For me, in a couple of my games, I have a concept when I need to think of something really quick, but I know something that I know will at least give them a laugh all the time is the funny madman. Or basically they need a source of information and there's something really weird and quirky about this old guy who basically sits in his house all day contemplating random stuff. Like the latest version of that in the Numenera game was in the city of Echoes, where basically they were going after this old Aeon priest who was retired. And they go to this place and he's just staring at them with a huge beard and nothing else on, screaming and ranting about his numerous crackpot, because he was like a complete and total conspiracy theorist. And screaming and ranting and raging, and eventually they were able to get information about it. And I've used that same concept for other games. Like in Pathfinder, he was a guy who was obsessed with identifying objects. It was an obsession. It's all he did in life. And basically that's my go-to in some instances.
It's still printing, so does anyone else got something else?
Megan?
Well, I was gonna say this also. Sir Emberly asked in the chat early on what our favorite NPC was and why. If you guys want to answer that too while you're answering this. I don't know if I have like a NPC archetype that they run into a lot. Probably just like someone that's really nervous and scared of them.
they must be making a great first impression.
Yeah.
Are your characters the baddies?
No, they're real nice. just Acer's character just really loves shooting things usually. But yeah, I don't know if I have an archetypal one. And I guess my favorite NPC I introduced into the scenario or into Amber Clave hasn't come out yet because we're already recording our second season and we're like 9 episodes into the first one on our release schedule. So I introduced a hidden city later on in the season that I really loved. And so you'll get to hear more from them soon.
I finally printed off my NPC.
Hey.
I finally printed off my NPC template.
Okay.
Okay.
What are we looking at here?
You're looking at cinnamon rolls. I just create the goodest of NPCs. I default to. I actually realized the other day that I have a lot of jerks, but I realized that Quest Friends needs more assholes or more at least nuanced characters. Because just like all my characters are just the nicest people, like all the ones that are on the side of the party. I think that's kind of my template. Is and I don't know why that is, but I tend to default to those kinds of characters, ones who are, but I don't have a specific type. As for favorite NPC, my goal with creating an NPC named Jesse was to recreate the feelings I had for Angus MacDonald from the Adventure Zone, which is just pure unbridled love. And so I'm very fond of them, but also a character. I'm just gonna take a first look at something you're gonna see tomorrow as like official promo art. This is a character who appeared in our last game and has many interactions with the character so far, but so far has shown up for 5 minutes of the podcast. I really, really like her. She is probably the main character on our listeners' minds at the moment because of a spoiler that happens when she shows up, but she is the strongest archetype of just the most pure character that I can think of, and not surprisingly, since that's my default, she's my current favorite.
I actually, thanks to my community, one of my NPCs from my D&D campaign jumped ship and ended up in Numenera. And because of that viewer decision, it kind of he's now become almost a trope in every single campaign where he started off life as essentially stuck inside a demonic Jumanji board game. Castles and Crusade is created by Larry Larkwood, and it was meant to be aping on one of my other campaigns that was going on at the time, so it was a little bit of interactivity between the two, and this character understood the world as if everything had mechanics, but didn't truly understand, like didn't see the world as you're playing D&D. He just saw everything has a chance, a statistic. You've got certain stats and abilities that other people don't. And so his madness, when he eventually came out, he was known as the Red Jester. He's actually in a few base monster manuals and such. You'll find like the Mad Jester or Jester with a skull that does a lot of, sort of dancing and prancing and maddening stuff. And I based it off of that. And after he realized his situation and who he was and how he was created, he realized that he's all about self-preservation and trying to make the best for himself. So he visits all the other campaigns and all the other heroes who are trying to fix the local landscape. And if they get stuck at any certain point, I introduce him, allow them to kind of have a little bit of an easier time, but then he gets something out of it. So it's just like, I give you all this information if you just go and save that small plot of land for me, because at some point I want to go to that point and stay there. Like he's on my Friday campaign, he's trying to sort out his holiday home. On my Monday campaign, he's got a castle that he thinks that he has. So he's got our adventurers to go off and go find it. But it helps them along their plot. But it's just that sort of, because I do a stream, it's probably that, it's that reoccurring character that keeps coming back. In my Numenera campaign, he is a street entertainer, an actual jester, but he's also part of a spy network. So he has all this information on people, and that's how I express the fact that he knows more than he should, is that he has all the information on our players. And it was very awkward for our players when they tried to deal with him and take him down, because he is such an annoying character. He's a mad jester who thinks everything and anything is funny, including, well, mainly murder.
Of course.
Oh, yeah,
And so when my players try to take him down, he goes, oh, so here's a little bit on your backstory, and here's a little bit on your backstory. Just have a look at it. You might appreciate the information that might be in there, and depending on what you decide to do, you might try something a little different. And it's that sort of slight creep, but he's vital, but you don't really want to deal with him, so it's kind of the necessary evil. So when my players get stuck, I bring in the necessary evil of, I'm going to help you out, but I'm going to enjoy it at the same time.
Before we continue, for any of our listeners, we have recorded the next 3 episodes, so I did not steal the idea from Tesla. Just to get this out there.
And he's also based off of, he has sort of very slight Shakespeare references, so you may have noticed poor Yorick
Oh, that's
in the
why
background.
he's always around.
Nice.
Yes, because the jester he's gone so far as... So I'm going to have to look, I'm looking for a prop right now, so if you give me 2 seconds.
Well, we have his time. Take as long as you need. We'll just be here. I guess we'll talk. How you guys doing? You okay? It's great? Fine?
We're good.
Sure. All right. I'm glad. Yep. You're drinking that water. Just gotta keeps you going.
Using my Contigo bottle. I actually really
Using
like this water bottle.
Using my cheap dollar store water bottle.
I am staying on brand with an octopus.
And then again, get those questions in there. I've got about 2 more that well, one is iterating, but I got 2 more, which both come from trees, because our bushes, our pile of leaves have now grown.
It's somewhere about, I can't find it, but I also have a Venetian. I also have a Venetian style Harlequin mask.
Ooh, that's
nice.
Cool.
To go with his aesthetic.
All right, if we're good for that, I've got Oh, do we got it?
No, what? That's right.
Oh, that's
there we
cool.
go.
So yeah, in every single game, he's identifiable by red, black, and gold.
Very cool.
So I can have him dress whatever he likes, but he's in those 3 colors, and all my players know about him, and it's either I can't wait to interact with him, or can you please never again? Which is like a sign of a memorable NPC if your players literally just want to be anywhere but where your NPC is. Sorry for interrupting anything.
Sorry, ever since I said bother Hallie, the harassment in the chat has not stopped, so I just wanted to take my word on it, which is that I am completely on their side. So I've got a few more questions. So we've talked a little bit, and I've just shown about how we can be cruel to players sometimes, but there is something that I'm kind of curious about, which, as I said, our pile of leaves has now evolved into a whole ass tree. And a whole ass tree asked a couple of questions, but the first one is what are your thoughts? Actually, this is kind of combined. So 2 questions. One, how easy do you think it is to TPK someone, a party in Numenera, or just get someone killed? And then second is, what are your thoughts on player and character death? Because it always varies, but I think especially in a podcasting format and a streaming format, that can take an interesting, different turn than regular gameplay, depending on how you play.
Could you please repeat the first half of the question? I didn't quite catch it. Sorry.
The first half is how easy is it to kill a player or TPK in a game, as opposed to something like D&D? And then what are your thoughts on player death and, to another extent, I guess, TPK?
For me, it depends entirely on the type of game you're playing and the mood of the players. Like even outside Numenera, like even the darkest and grimmest games, I don't necessarily do full-on death rules because I always feel death should be important and dramatic. For 1 or 2 of the games that may change, in Numenera specifically, at least I feel the characters in Numenera, as they evolve, become extremely powerful. It's explicit in the book that they're some of the most powerful. As they grew up in tiers, they become some of the most powerful people in the Steadfast and perhaps in Numenera. And basically, if there's going to be a death, it has to be important to the story. It can't just be entirely random. That's my opinion anyway.
Okay.
I think you have to really want to kill your players in Cypher games to kill them. Like you have to be setting something super overpowered to hit them. Because I almost never even get my characters impaired, and almost never debilitated. I can't ever remember the debilitation rules because I never get that far. But I don't mind character death if I'm running another game, especially like Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green. I kill characters all the time. But in something like Numenera or like this, especially like in Numenera, it's something that I talk to and make sure it's okay with the player before killing their character, because it's just, I have to actively want to do it in Numenera for it to go off. And usually, despite what my players may tell you, I don't enjoy killing characters. I just get really nervous when I do kill them and I start laughing.
That's your excuse and you're sticking to it.
Yeah.
I think I agree. It's very difficult to passively kill off any Numenera character after, say, level 2 or something, because they have the knowledge to know that they need to do all these rests and other bits and bobs. They have all these extra abilities, access to healing and other ways to regenerate themselves in certain fashions. And the only way that I've found to really put on the pressure is because I just had about 4 or 5 sessions which had no break. So it was just one long extended episode, almost like a scene, which just followed them. So they didn't get a chance to rest well. They didn't get the chance to sort of take their 10 hours or their 1 hour rest. So they were constantly kind of having to go, right, I need to rest a little bit now and hopefully try to get a little bit more. I actually nearly killed off someone, but you really do have to engineer the scenario around that to make it so that either they're expending more points out of their pools than normal to do certain things where you just say, right, I need a level of effort based off of that task. Usually you wouldn't necessarily apply it, but you're having to artificially inflate the difficulty to start chipping away at their pools because, like I said, we know combat is not the main focus, and so you have to find other ways to deplete those pools without actively having to do so, because players usually are quite sensible when it comes to, I'm not going to risk too much of one pool at any one time.
That's agreed. We can tell how we feel about how about losing points is because I have to respond in my chat right now because one of my friends was like, hey, can we retcon that we rested in this area that we could rest? So that shows how my cast feels about resting and shows about how strong of teeth I have. I agree. I think it's really hard to kill someone. The only death I've seen in a Cypher System game was the final boss of the Strange campaign, the Dark Spiral, who is cheap as shit. They're a very cheap boss. So I'm not so. But it was fun because they killed our unkillable character. Like he was basically a god who just avoided all damage and just insta-killed, and he just got brutally slaughtered. While my squishy wizard made it out okay. But I agree it's very hard. I agree you have to try. I am very worried about my campaign because the quest friend stories usually take place over one day, and the game goes for about 6 months for each arc. So they're basically wars of attrition, and there's almost no opportunity to rest. And even if there was, again, my players wouldn't take it. Because they always forget. Because I don't have...
that's the thing you need to do. It has to be basically the way to do anything to a character in Numenera is attrition. Mm-hmm. It's just deny them the ability to get back to where they were.
But when it comes for teeth, I know I'm a softie. In Quest Friends, I've made it explicit that if it is a plot-centric point and it doesn't mess with the character's arc, I might kill them. But that basically means the characters are safe until the finale for reasons. But a rule I've heard for streamed games that I really, really like is a rule one of my first GMs came up with, which is basically you get killed, you can get murdered, but it can only be by a named character. So it's never like, oh, this random mook got the jump on you, and oops, you're dead.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. I think a way to get around that is to not really ever have combats against random mooks, but as a go-to rule, I really like if they have a name, they can.
Oh, I like that because you could apply that to any campaign.
Yeah, that's pretty good idea, actually.
And it also then gives the players a reason to then either fear someone or go off and try to murder them because they have a face and now a name rather than Goblin number 3.
Yeah. Really good with that stabbing knife, Goblin. Really good.
Yeah,
they all look the same. Let's murder them all.
He just goes in for the final swing. By the way, my name.
Montana! You murdered my father.
Oh god, he's a character. I'm gonna die. Up here for the
actually, I now want to do that. That there is if a random NPC, random little no named NPC does end up killing someone, they have to do like an epic murder. Like, I am blah, 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 and you murdered blah, 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 blah. I am taking vengeance. And it's just like, who are you?
Hey, that's actually a really good adventure hook, though, because it's like, wow, this guy was the villain in someone else's story. We should probably figure out what happened.
I've never seen them in my life. It wasn't my fault.
No, I'm curious how that works for characters who are named but don't actually have their real name as their name. Because we have a named character who just at one point jokingly... He was like, I'm Fancy Tom, which is the name of a different character, but I never specified his name, so we just call him what he fake called himself. So does he have a name? Does he not? It doesn't matter. He's very worthless, and he will never kill anyone. But all right, let me move on to the other question from a whole ass tree.
That tree is just full of questions.
Yeah, these bushes, these leaves. There's some leaf pun in there, but I can't think of it.
Yeah.
And this ties in with another prompt that I got was kind of opposite here. What's the thing of making a game that you're most proud of? We talked about this a little bit beforehand, but like of world building, of NPCs, of moments you made. What's the thing that really sticks out to you? Is like, man, this was super cool. I was great. But then also, what's been your biggest regret in game? The biggest thing you kind of look back on and you're like. Either think of as learning your biggest regret in game. I don't know why I keep elaborating these. Thing you're biggest proud of and your biggest regret.
Okay. The thing I'm most proud of is when they went to the City of Echoes, And I created a concept where basically, well, in the City of Echoes, basically, every once in a while there's a random, like, translucent, you can put your hand through copy of a person's actions at any moment in time. And during the course of the story, it's discovered that the reason this happens is because a previous civilization, basically, they had plays, but to them, the most highest form of art was life. So basically, they had an art form where a person would die and their spirit would come out, and basically their entire life after death was performing the act of whatever somebody close by is doing, and that's considered art in that time. Civilization died, people came back, people started coming back, humans came in. They said they see these random copies, they don't know what's going on, but to these ghost people, they're making a performance.
Oh, okay.
I really like the idea I created. My biggest regret is when one of my characters accidentally caused the murder of an entire city.
Well, that's
because the entire city was on top of a whale, and I put one of my players is basically like sort of like half human, or basically he has basically turns into a monster.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be under a full moon. But the whale basically went for help from his monster side to save the whale. And as the story continued, I thought maybe there might be some struggle, but I forgot to realize that basically my character was playing with the fact that he enjoys being that monster side. He doesn't really consider himself human. So when the whale went like, "Hey, will you help me by getting rid of this brain thing on me so I can sink?" My player's like, "Sure." And I thought, I really should have thought of that. And basically, the story happened where basically he ripped the thing that was controlling the whale, and the whale immediately started to sink, and people in the city were trying to leave, and there were thousands of people on top of the whale. There wasn't enough time to save everybody. So as the story went, they kind of helped with the murder of several hundred people, and that became a thing.
Okay, I think with my one, I can't remember if you were actually part of it, Megan. It was a storyline from when I was doing on a previous channel, and two of my characters had established like fake identities. And so one of my characters had so there was a little bit complicated, but we'll start off with basically in one of the other cities I think it was in Kai, there were two rival sort of gangster factions going on for control of the city, because there's the Marish clan in Kai that's kind of important in that sort of story setting. So one of my players decided to be part of that family but got disowned, and one of the other factions was trying to do this whole mobster wedding thing, and unfortunately the woman that was being wed believed in true love rather than being wed off to some random person. So she knew that the person that she loved was enemies with this other dude, so went to him to fake her own kidnapping. The other dude was just like, "Oh, I can just pretend to kidnap her and then actually kidnap the guy I want to kidnap while he goes and rescues her." This is like, and nobody will be none the wiser. So he does so, establishes himself as a future character. I then have both the guy that he kidnaps and the woman escape, sort of like take new identities. They then turned up as characters in my game, which he didn't know about because they had fake identities. And the woman that was after the guy had a further fake identity so that the guy didn't know who she was. So it was this big sort of reveal when one of the NPCs was a little psychic and was able to say, "No, you weren't spending time there. You were actually there." And then the other character goes, "Wait, you were from my city. How do you know who I am?" And then he goes, "Oh, I know exactly who you are." He reveals his character, saying, "You're the guy that kidnapped me." And my other player goes, "Oh my god, no, what? It was blah 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 blah." And then they talk about how it was over some woman that he never loved, but had to go rescue her anyway. And then she turns around and says, "How dare you? How can you not have ever loved me?" And then he goes, oh shit.
So we just had an impromptu soap opera happen.
It was brilliant because they weren't expecting it, and it was just sort of like one reveal and then another reveal and then another reveal. Because I remember actually that person that escaped, actually Asa and Megan played two characters in that game. They guested in that game that actually told the PC that this character had escaped, and that player ignored that information. So I was just like, how could I bring in that information back later on and kick him in the ass for forgetting? And so I brought in basically his entire backstory to play live out in front of him with other players. And that was my favorite thing. The worst thing was my players also, same campaign, different arc, were creating drugs.
As you do.
As you do. And they were working for a criminal organization that was cutting cigarettes with it, but it wasn't a drug that made you hallucinate or anything like that. It just made the cigarette taste of the most amazing thing your taste buds would ever have tasted. Yeah? Like your favorite thing in the entire world that you could eat forever and a day. And the smoke smelt like freshly baked bread, not like cigarettes. So it was pleasant tasting, still highly addictive, and didn't really bother people when you started doing it around people. However, it had a super high addictive property to the point where if you didn't smoke the cigarette, you got so hungry because you couldn't satisfy the hunger. Because you couldn't, nothing in the real world tasted like that cigarette. So they're constantly trying to search for food to fill themselves up. Eventually they just wither away. And so it's meant to be activated inside of a cigarette with heat.
Yeah.
What happens if the entirety of the factory, that's the drug factory that's producing it, is set on fire?
Great things.
Great things. So then there is this entire noxious blue cloud floating through a densely populated skyscraper city. And everyone goes, oh, can you smell that? That smells like our cooks must be back. She must be baking bread. And so everyone upstairs is just like, close the windows, shut the door, and waiting for the smell of freshly baked bread to go past. And that killed a lot of people.
I regret none of my towns getting
No.
destroyed. Not one do I regret. Do you want to go, Megan? Or otherwise I can.
Sure. I think one of my favorite things I put in the game was just in the episodes we just did where they're underwater and they accidentally get eaten by a living dungeon and then they have to find their way out of it. And I just really enjoyed like the idea that they're like being swallowed and going down through its digestive system as they find all the other people who it's trapped and eaten as well. I don't know if I have something I really regret doing. Like anything that I really regret doing is in like other game systems. So I'm happy with everything we put out with Numenera so far. I made all my mistakes there.
I have the thing I like most is basically the entirety of chapter 3. I'm very proud of Lorraine. Lorraine, for context, one of my characters did not have a backstory, so I just gave him the worst backstory. I told Hallie, I'm like, hey, what if your character had a rival? And it started as that. And I'm like, and then it just spiraled out of control until she became the worst NPC and the worst villain out of all of them. But I really like the town it's set in. It's called Roulettia, and it's basically, what if you crossed Rapture from BioShock with Las Vegas, with the Magic Kingdom at Disney World, with Monstro from Pinocchio, and all those four things really combined well to make this, basically this hyper-commercialized town that, like, is just really unethical and just focuses on making a quick buck, but is like very family friendly in its exterior. And I really like it. I think it's a fun, vibrant place that fits well with Numenera despite being an original thing. My biggest regret is that I originally wanted to be inside a space whale because Hallie hates whales. and this whole chapter is about torturing her character. So I thought, well, let's throw in a little bit extra for Hallie. And I thought mantles were space whales because Tom told me they were space whales. And then I found out they were space manta rays, and I was very disappointed because they were just too far apart. I couldn't justify it being a space whale anymore. So that's one regret. Although that's more a regret for Tom than it is for me. My actual biggest regret is early on there was a plot important moment where one of the characters gets bitten by a spider, and he takes a -1. He has basically every intellect roll for him is one step harder. I kind of regret that because that happened for a whole chapter, which for a chapter for us is like 5-6 months of gameplay, and he was a nano, and that just I thought it would encourage more interesting gameplay, and we don't have a whole lot of mechanics, but I think that was a little too rough. But also one of the characters tried to get out the spider, and she rolled a natural 20. And I really needed that spider in that character, so I basically just had it have no effect, which I did something similar later in the game to a great story benefit. But I think in that moment I should have given some sort of benefit. So I've always thought if I could go back that like the character would do it, she'd try to stab the spider, same thing would happen, the spider would break and it would just like kind of still be in this character, but I would have just removed the -1 intellect penalty and just had any sort of negative effects be story-based things. Because I felt like I really just invalidated that role and also just made that character's life a living hell for a good long while. All right, I think I think we're near close a point to wrapping up. Do any of you? I have one last question. Do any of you have any thoughts you want to talk about? Does anyone in the chat have anything that they're really burning for us to talk about before we hit that point? Okay, we're getting bread puns. So
there's so many good bread puns.
Yeah, they are certainly rising to the occasion.
Sorry, I was distracted by the pun I was putting in there. There we go. Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
That's fine. So I got one last question, which is very, very important to me. The capital of Draeolus, is it Key or is it Kai? How do you pronounce the capital of Draeolus?
I say Kai because the thing is half of Kai is in the sky, and it makes most sense to me if that rhymes. Why wouldn't it rhyme? But I think actually, like Moneycook Games pronounce it Kai.
I think it's Key because I think of it almost like how people would pronounce Quay or K, as in the thing on the ocean, the thing next to the ocean, which is Quay or something like that. And I'm going, it's the same sort of thing. If it was spelt a little differently, then yeah, it would be Quay, okay. But it's QI, so it's Kai.
I think it's Kai because I believe in peer pressure.
There we go.
It's Key, and I will say this until the day I die. Nope. I will fight all of you on this.
Like Key and Quay.
But it actually it makes sense in my version of the Ninth World, because every city in the Ninth World that I created is the worst. So they deliberately make something where it's like, it's Key in the sky, and not realize that they could have made a much better rhyme there. Like, oh, this looks like a rhyme. All right. Chaotic neutral alignments. Will Sunny, feel free to ask about that in our Tumblr, because if you get on True Neutral, Tom will go to town about how he feels about D&D alignments. Well, in that case, if we don't have anything else, I'd say it's time for us. Let's, go on who you are. Thanks so much for anyone who listens. Thanks so much for all of you for being part of this roundtable. It was a lot of fun to talk about and see what people thought.
Thank you for having us.
And then, just kind of repeat your name. Tell me about your show. We'll start left to right as we see here. So the Amber Clave. Megan, what is the Amber Clave?
So the Amber Clave is a relatively new compared to everyone else here, actual play Numenera podcast. The first season pulls really heavily from Into the Deep. So they're underwater for most of it. I hit all the big cities, and then we go to some other places, and they get to fight things underwater while I ignore the underwater fighting rules. So it works out really well. And so they basically belong to an organization that wants to protect the world. And that's the Amber Clave. It's sort of a spin-off of the Eon Priests that is less bigoted against mutants and extraterrestrials. And then also, you can also find me running Numenera on the Redacted Files, our original podcast, if you look for Mysteries of the Ninth World. And that started out as a run through the Devil's Spine scenario, and then I turned it into a Mythos Cthulhu thing. So if you like those things, you should check that out.
How surprising!
All right, Tesla, the RPG Lab. Tell us about your one Numenera podcast and your many D&D ones.
Okay, so we do D&D set in the same homebrew universe, just in different regions, 5 times a week. So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday are all different D&D campaigns set in different regions. On Saturdays, we do community games, and we're going to be doing more roundtables, community casting, and spotlighting on creators, and doing other things to sort of like help out GM-wise the people in the community. But on Wednesdays, we do our Numenera campaign, the City of Otranto. It's getting up to its 50th episode, which is pretty long. I think it's getting there anyway. And because of that, we are actually coming to a close of our first season. As I've said, it is essentially a city/large business factory. Everything that you could do on one company has just been taken offshore. And it's been recolonized millions of years later. And our players are slowly, and the citizens are slowly discovering what lies beneath their city, and have awoken a long dormant AI from another place colloquially known as the Sun Demon. And the AI that controls the city, known as Magai, is helping our players try to exorcise that demon from the city. But it looks like our players are not going to be successful. And let's just say that although this city now floats upon the ocean, in season 2, they're going to be floating among the stars as Plan B is put into motion.
Dun, dun, dun.
All right, well, I can't follow up to that. All I know is that if you really like that story, onto Quest Friends, I'm Kyle, I run Quest Friends. If you like that story about the killer cloud, you're going to love our story, because that's the main plot point. A cloud that just murders everything. And again, I did not steal it from the Adventure Zone, I swear.
See, you got the Jester and a killer cloud. I think I'll have to go talk to my suing department. My lawyer.
She's not a jester. She just knows everything and uses it against the players.
So that's technicality, that.
Okay, that's true. All right, so I run Quest Friends. Quest Friends is a podcast, heavily edited, very short, releases every other Monday. We have characters. I pulled up the cinnamon rolls again. Our characters and cast have been described as cinnamon roll pure. We're just here for like a good story, good time, really. Like, we try to focus on having really, as much as I like torching Hallie, on really kind of well-intentioned, meaning humor. I feel like we're a pretty good mix of, like, if you want something that's fairly lighthearted but also gets very serious, I think we're a good fit. I think the best tone I can imagine is it's kind of like those really good kids cartoons, like something like Gravity Falls, where it's like there's a lot of humor, but also like it's not just like jokey all the time. But yeah, so our story takes place predominantly in the Steadfast. Right now, our main villains are the Jagged Dream, who have been heavily modified, and also a giant black cloud that just flies around consuming people, and it's very bad. And finally, one of our characters right now, if you want to start, I would suggest starting at Hopper's Memory Part 1. Hop's Memory Part 1, that's where we really kind of reflect on our main character and our current villain, who is essentially the one who, despite all of Hopper's best intentions, never, ever got away. All right, so that's Quest
drama,
Friends.
tension.
And then Jesus, tell us about Fandible.
Hey guys, I'm Jesus from the Fandible podcast. The Fandible podcast has been around for 8 years, where every Friday we post various different games. We played everything from indie games, World of Darkness, Warhammer 40K, and superhero games, and a bunch of other stuff because we just love playing all these random games. But in the last 2 years, we started the Fandible Long Shot, which is our long-running Numenera game that's been posted every week, which initially starts as your traditional adventure story where a man who doesn't consider himself human, more of a man-monster hybrid, simple tailor who you later find out might be a bit more murderous, guy with a voice in his head, and a naive girl who loves science are joined together and find out that there's more connection between them than they realize. It's an interesting story, interesting campaign, and at this point in the story, they're going to fight a digital clone of the monster character to find out what he knows so that they can fight a killer god who might be trying to destroy the universe.
Well,
that all makes sense. That all does make sense.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense.
That's the only time you can say a bunch of random stuff and just say it's part of Numenera and people will believe it.
All right, yeah.
All right. Well, again, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. If you still want to chat a little bit, I'm going to leave the stream up, not with our faces, but I'm going to leave the stream up for 5 minutes. It'll have links to all of our websites and the RPG Lab. I just did your Twitch because that's probably where you want people to subscribe to.
Yes, thank you. We are actually live in a couple of hours.
Yeah. If you enjoyed listening to Tesla's melodic voice, you can join it in. You can
join with all the other liars.
Join him in the RPG Lab in a couple hours. You said.
Yeah. In about it should be in about an hour and 20 if we have everyone able to turn up.
And the rest of us, we will see you.
Yep.
Well, literally right now because we're podcasts. Go download us right now.
Yeah.
All right. So long.
Thank you very much. See you guys later.